I awoke in an empty and dark building, not remembering who or what I was. There was a corpse in a corner, a maiden with her blood only recently spilled. A statue reached its hand out towards me. This place had been abandoned years ago. Plants had crept inside, and there were holes in the ceiling. I had to get out of there. I finally managed to open the heavy doors. I did not expect this. A dark sky and a sea of fog. There was an unsettling castle far away, and a tree so imposing that it dwarfed the large structure. I slowly approached an old wooden bridge, which crossed a deep abyss of fog. Something filled me with anticipation, and I ran lively towards a large open space. As I crossed the threshold, I realized something was off. Then it came. It came from the sky, a horrendous creature with sword and a golden shield. As it violently pierced me, everything became black, and I woke up another place entirely. The unfortunate encounter faded into oblivion, and dazed I found myself in a puddle of muddy water. I was in a cave, it seemed, and as I rose, despite of weary limbs and the soft murmur of pain in my aching body, I felt that the stairs in front of me would take me to another world. Walking up the stairs, I felt a peculiar sense of wonder. A wooden door was left open. Someone had apparently been here before. I came across a humming wall of what seemed to be fog. It shielded an area below me. I left it undisturbed. A corpse with a glow lit the darkness, and I carefully approached some sort of device. It began to move and pushed me up to where I did not know. It reached its destination, and I opened one last door. A most unexpected scenery of lush greenery, eerie ruins, and a golden knight on a noble steed revealed itself to me. The strange man with the white mask just stood there, smilingly, and could not be trusted. Still, I felt an urge to talk to him, like a moth drawn to a flame. He told me that I had arrived in the lands between, and described Castle Stormveil, the structure which lay behind him, home of a terrifying lord by the name of Godrick.
You are fated, it seems, to die in obscurity.
What a loathsome lover of sheep. I left the vile man to his own devices and began walking towards the nearby ruins. Little did I know that the noble knight on the majestic steed was nothing more than a horrendous murderer. I was smashed to bits and woke in front of the grinning man with the white mask. Somehow, I had once again avoided dying, and a realization dawned in me. Death was nowhere to be found. Suffering, on the other hand, was everywhere. As I sneaked into the church ruins that evening, I could hear the terrible moaning of poor souls. Listening to their suffering, I entered the dimly lit place of worship. Here I found a rather peculiar creature. The curious-looking fellow didn't grab his weapon like expected. Instead, he began conversing me. It was a welcome change. I was still rattled by the brutal golden knight patrolling the church grounds. The friendly being went by the name of Cayley. He was a merchant and told me that I was something called Tarnished. Apparently, I was not the only one to enter this domain of suffering. I took the opportunity to rest at the nearby bonfire, garnering a couple of hours of uneasy sleep. A little more rested, I decided to venture into the woods under the cover of night. The white-masked devil's talk about Godrick's castle had ignited my interest. Surely, if I was to find my destiny in this forsaken world, I would have to muster the courage to see, truly see, what haunted these lands. Several brutish soldiers with torches were guarding some ruins. I took one lonely fellow down and did my best not to raise their suspicions as I sneaked close to a nearby bonfire. I had only just sat down when an apparition appeared out of thin air. She looked at me and said,
"Have you heard of the Finger Maidens?"
During what seemed like both an eternity and a fleeting moment, she conveyed crucial knowledge to me.
And aid
I was told about the Finger Maidens, a group serving something called the Two Fingers. She gifted me a curious horse and offered to become my maiden, whatever that entailed. And then, just like that, she left me alone. I knew I had to reach Godrick's castle, but I wasn't sure if it was a good idea without gear. I was in dire need of some equipment, something that could help me in my endeavor, because this, the long journey ahead of me, was most likely going to take a lifetime. These soldiers were in Godrick's service. I overheard some of the men talking about their lord and his apparently grotesque practice of something called grafting. Interestingly, they also seemed to be guarding valuable gear in heavy chests, so I was inclined to take a look. I disposed of the sorry fellow who had forgotten all about his previous and untimely death, and found in the chest a magnificently well-crafted great sword. Who would leave such a possession at this very juncture, if not whatever divine being had designed this forsaken world? Surely this was fate. Then, with the glorious great sword in my hands, I felt something stir within me. I was tired of being torn to pieces by monstrosities on golden horses. I had enough and felt a lust for blood to be spilled. Their blood. I went to every single soldier in that damn camp and took them down. I killed them as they were quietly talking to each other at their bonfires. I annihilated them, and it felt liberating and justified. As dawn came, I had cleared out the camp, but I didn't feel satisfied. Their heinous ways of living had to be punished. I might have come to this place with no memory of my former self, but the path ahead of me now glowed with sacred purpose. Yet dark days followed in the wake of my massacre. I rested my weary limbs at the bonfire. At dawn I got up and once again haunted the resurrected soldiers like a fiend out of a nightmare. I did it for what seemed like an eternity. It felt unreal. There was nothing but endless killing and destruction without remorse. Even worse was that I could feel their life force enter my being. For every poor bastard that died, I seemed to grow in strength and endurance. I lost count of the days. I lost myself in the harvesting of those dark souls. Then, in the middle of that haze of death, I saw letters written on the ground. They glowed eerily like something not of this world. It was a message, and it said, "Be wary of monster." Where that monster was, I knew not. Still, the pulsating message had me wondering and made me look, actually look, at my surroundings. I had been so preoccupied with mindlessly harvesting the soldiers that it was only now that I noticed a distinct glimmer in the middle of the camp. There I discovered something quite special, a detailed map of extraordinary scope. Stained as it was, the parchment contained so much knowledge it was hard to stay clear-headed. This was a vast world. One thing stood out, namely Godrick's stronghold. Apparently it was called Stormveil Castle, and it was not far from here. I sighed, looked at the corpses that would come back to life within hours, and left the ruins for good. Walking north in the direction of the infamous castle, the stars shone their ever-so-distant and cold light upon me. As I went through a monumental arch leading to a heavily guarded ravine, I dispatched some soldiers, but was taken aback when a hideous troll came roaring down from somewhere above. It would have eaten me had I not remembered Melina's gift. Desperately, I summoned the creature. I flew past both troll and henchman, riding with uncanny speed. Within minutes, I had left them all behind. I finally reached a little shack. Alas, someone was there, waiting in the shadows. To my surprise, the stranger turned out to be a young girl, a being whose fragility seemed particularly out of place in this dark and moist shack in the middle of nowhere. Her name was Roderica, and she told me a most disturbing story. Apparently, her people had been taken by someone and had been grafted. It seemed as if that meant they had their limbs removed and stuck to a spider. Her tale made me shiver. but also ignited a hateful urge. Nobody deserved a fate like that, least of all a young and innocent soul, such as this. She asked me to convey a message to someone called the Chrysalids, namely that she eventually would join them, when she had mustered the courage that a gentle creature like her should be suffering from a derangement which made her yearn for death. That was an obscene crime, which had to be punished. Growling and sick in my heart, I continued northward. I summoned my steed and already felt more at ease with its graceful movements. We headed north along an old brick road, passing some guards, not bothering with more lowly henchmen. Finally, we reached a dark tunnel. Surely this was the entrance to the stronghold, as it was heavily guarded by fierce soldiers behind explosive ballistae. As I entered the dark structure, I began to experience something other than merely rage. I now felt a distinct sense of expectation as well, and I could tell that something was waiting for me in there. The darkness almost seemed to hum with a hidden presence. Then, at last, I proceeded to face whatever was waiting for me. I noticed bloodstains and touched them. A red phantom equipped with armor like mine appeared and died. What had killed that unfortunate knight? Hesitantly I proceeded. Then a roaring voice came from above. A large and grotesque-looking figure descended upon me, making the ground shake as waves of dust clouded my eyes. As the dust settled, a monstrosity with a magnificent cane rose to his feet. He called himself Margit the Fell and declared his intent to extinguish my flame. And then the fight began. I made a heavy swing, yet he didn't even flinch. Instead, he began beating me like a rabid dog, and within seconds I was annihilated. Overwhelmed, I awoke and noticed a message I had overlooked. Mockingly it said, "Suffering ahead." Then, bruised and humiliated, I realized that I had to better myself. I trembled in front of the shimmering yellow wall and retreated to the bonfire, shaken to my core. Then she appeared, the maiden who had asked me to bring her along to the mysterious Erd Tree, now revealed that she had fed me falsehoods and tested me. She offered to take me to a place where champions supposedly gathered. I couldn't help myself. I took her hand and vanished. When I regained my senses, I found myself in a magnificently warm hall with bright lights, a grand round table, and several peculiar individuals who hardly noticed my sudden arrival. Yet the place was reassuringly silent and felt like a sheltered fortress of contemplation and deep rest. Oh, how I needed this. I spent the next couple of days in Roundtable Hold, conversing with its various inhabitants. Gideon Ofnir, the leader of this much-needed sanctuary, turned out to be both exceptionally knowledgeable and deeply unpleasant. I also talked to Smithing Master Hugh, a brutish, albeit kind-hearted servant who was feverishly preoccupied with his work. But by far the most peculiar creature was an elusive woman dressed entirely in black. Her name was Fear. Seconds after meeting her, she asked for permission to hold me tight. 'Twas a sacred custom among her people. She sought my warmth, and I agreed to her request, hiding a pleasurable sensation behind a thin veil of generosity. It felt obscenely delightful. I spent what seemed like endless days slowly walking the corridors of the Roundtable Hold and found a soothing spot in Ofnir's library. There I almost lost myself in leisurely contemplation. Then, one day when visiting Smithing Master Hugh, I found myself admiring his craftsmanship and realized that I had drowned myself in apathy. I had to go back. I parted ways with the enchanting lady who had given me so much warmth and returned to Limgrave. We rode south in sobering weather, but a couple of miles down the road, something deeply unsettling appeared. Quickly I retreated and headed to the nearby hills. From that stony high ground, I saw two trolls, impaled by huge metal shafts. I fled that depraved caravan, continued southward, and approached a heavily guarded bridge, decorated with corpses. I managed to cross the bridge, but only with the help of Torrent. Much to my surprise, I found a blind and abandoned maiden. She came from a castle in the south that was under siege. Her father, who was in charge, had remained there, and she implored me to bring him a letter. Intrigued by this development, I agreed. Continuing south, I rode through ominous ravines and finally crossed a breached outer wall. From there I could see the castle. As I got closer, I had to avoid an enormous creature and entered a blood-stained and empty corridor. The castle was in a sorry state. Soldiers had been strung up like dogs, and corpses were burning in a smouldering pile of blackened flesh. Surely this had to be hell. My blood boiled with hatred as I walked slowly into their midst. A heavy swing stunned the first hideous being, and so the killing began, and they came down on me, like nightmarish insects with rusty blades and bodies marked by sickness and filth. Finally, their gruesome leader, a particularly large beast, in vain tried to overpower me, but the magnificent greatsword I had found earlier helped me ensure victory. Exhausted, I walked among the scorched and disfigured corpses. Why would anyone do this? At the top of the pile, a now blackened servant had been clung to a large wooden pole. No one would remember him as he slowly decomposed. Passing an abandoned armory, I went further into the castle. Scattered groups of soldiers were fighting the loathsome creatures, but this time I sneaked past them all, not caring anymore. In my search for the blind girl's father, I ended up in the middle of a vicious skirmish. 'Twas a madhouse, bereft of reason. Finally I found him and gave him the letter. Edgar explained how the servants had revolted and caused the end of this once proud stronghold. He had to stay behind to protect the legendary sword of Morne, and asked me to convey the message to his daughter. Attempting to flee the hellish slaughterhouse, I lost my way and accidentally ventured deeper into the dark pathways of the ancient castle. There I saw something eerie, glowing jellyfish on a sandy beach next to a shimmering yellow wall. This hardly bode well. I made my way down to the shimmering gateway, and as I entered, I was confronted by a hideously large and sickening creature, not entirely unlike those wretched beings the soldiers fought. The ensuing fight was fierce, but the wicked thing seemed to be in decline. It was not aware of its surroundings, nor was it able to control itself. Furiously it threw itself at me, showing no sign of reasoning or care about the openings it accidentally made. Something was happening to me. I grew stronger and clearly felt a hidden power wake within. After delivering the disease-ridden fiend its final blow, I found Edgar and assured him that the sword was safe and that he could leave. As I finally rode back north, I felt joyous at the prospect of Irina and her father fleeing this gruesome place. They deserved a peaceful life. I hadn't been on the road for long when something caught my eye and made me shiver. It was Edgar. He was on his knees in the mud, next to his daughter, who neither moved nor spoke. She had been killed by some roaming bandit. The rain couldn't wash the pain away, and as I listened to the mourning father, I felt a coldness spread deep inside me. In my search for relief, I rode north. There I came upon a camp of outlaws, which I tore into in my desperation for anything but this hellish cold within. It was here that I found a way to kindle my weapon. What was this world, if not an infected wound? I realized I could cleanse it and end the howls of suffering. It needed to be scorched. In the wake of my frenzied realization, I rode into the wild, wanting to burn this world to a cinder. It was at this point that I entered a forest and came upon a shadowy rotunda. Some sort of wizardry was afoot, causing its large doors to open on their own. Amused, I entered the corridor and stepped onto a platform, which began to move down, but for how long I could not tell. Finally I saw something. Buildings appeared under an alien sky. There was, if I were to believe my eyes, another world down here. Then it came fully into view, and I was flabbergasted. Above imposing and seemingly ancient structures, there was a vast sky full of stars. What was this strange place? And more importantly, where was I? Who had made these crumbling buildings, and where were they? In this ruin I came upon some peculiar creatures. Unreal as it seemed, they were made from clay instead of flesh. What a curious thing, condemned to walk for all eternity, guarding forgotten ruins under unseen stars. Riding through a dark and watery ravine, I was almost eaten by an enormous crab, and the air was full of tension. Finally we arrived at a wide open space, but we were not by any means prepared for the sight that followed. About a mile away, large pillars stood next to a majestic and ancient stairway, and even more eerie, one could see a brightly glowing palace in the sky. This tranquil realm was clearly devoid of wickedness. It was at this point that I noticed a brazier. It was meant to be lit. By doing so, I apparently also ignited one of the pillars by the stairway. I followed the light into a ruinous temple, empty but for a large carcass of what had once been a glorious elk. It seemed I had to light every brazier in this peaceful wilderness. Surely it would be a pleasant stroll. It was not. This ethereal land turned out to be a deceptive illusion, plagued by shimmering globes of death, nightmarish crabs from hell itself, degenerate archers, and axe-wielding inbred mongrels. At the end of that dreadful day, I had managed to light them all. Upon touching the glowing carcass, I saw something not of this world. I was transported to a silent cavern, in which an enormous elk slowly began walking toward me. The sound of its hooves could be heard clearly. Then it took off, jumped through the very air, and came down upon me. Such breathtaking power, this being had an inscrutable beauty. The magnificence of it made me gasp. I did not want to kill this noble creature. Why did it attack? When I finally delivered the killing blow to this majestic animal, I was pierced by a deep sorrow within as it gave one final roar. In the silence that followed the killing, I came upon a message written in glowing letters. It said, "Be wary of sadness." Feeling sick at heart over the needless killing, I began the journey back. After one last glimpse at the underground city, we finally rode under the rainy clouds of Limgrave. Chance took me to an abandoned church with a statue, clearly depicting a holy woman of great importance. In this overgrown ruin, I found a strengthening substance and a wondrous golden flask, promising great powers. Taking a moment to study it all, I noticed a peculiar light in some bushes nearby. And just like that, I found myself in another land entirely, plagued by a giant gargoyle waiting in silence, a suffocating sky, and foul winds. What had I done? Terrified by this rotting wasteland, I sneaked back to the intimidating building. Much to my dismay, I discovered that someone was already here, in this surprisingly warm shelter. It turned out to be a gruesome being, hunched over and growling like a beast. It did not utter one word, but merely snarled. I could not take this any more and fled the otherwise comfortable hall. Running through the wilderness, I was attacked by small vicious critters, and it felt like the very air itself wanted to infect me with the wretched sickness of this land. Finally, I came to a large bridge and was confronted with a terrifying sight, and to think that I, days before, had considered Castle Morne hell. Looking back, I saw petrified monstrosities, frozen for all eternity in stone pillars. What horrifying cataclysm had done this? I was stranded in a sea of emptiness. Not particularly happy with my predicament, I rode, horrified, past the Guardian on the bridge. During the next hours, I came upon graves with forgotten treasures, a menacing, rot-inflicted tree, and peculiar gusts of wind enabling us to reach great heights. But I nearly lost my sanity as I drew close to a dark castle, and an enormous sleeping dragon seemingly rooted to the poisonous ground. Following a smouldering wall, I discovered a sandy beach, and in the distance the silhouette of a faraway castle. Close by, however, there was an abandoned church, and light was flickering within. Maybe I could finally get some sleep. As I got to the church, I finally saw whence the light came, and found a noble maiden leaning against a demolished wall, writhing in pain. Addressing her, she told me to leave, and that she was inflicted with scarlet rot. Still, I spent the night here, silently listening to her moans of anguish. In the morning, I could now see the castle clearly, yet I'd rather be torn apart by dragons than travel to that fortress, reeking as it did of suffering. I recognized the land for what it was, a place of decay. If only there had been a way to help that young woman. Riding north, I felt hope slowly growing, despite of the abominable and pus-filled nature surrounding me. That is, until I reached a caravan destroyed by fiendish dogs, one of which had taken an interest in me. And then it was upon me, trying to tear me to pieces and devour me. I barely managed to deal with the grotesque animal, and then carefully proceeded to the abandoned wagon. Climbing its steps, I opened a large chest, not knowing what to expect in such a place. To my bewilderment, it held a great sword more impressive than anything I had ever seen. I equipped the giant blade and had to use both of my hands. It was that heavy. Surely, this was not made for mere mortals. Still, the power of this mighty weapon flowed through me, and I felt a distinct urge to go berserk, killing every vile creature in this god-forsaken land. Helpless against that ancient call of violence, I could not ignore it and got swept away by a fog of fury. Slowly regaining my composure, I found myself riding further north. As I arrived at some cabins made by unknown and long-dead explorers, an important realization struck me. I could not allow myself to wield that vulgar blade anymore. It would, of this I was certain, lead me astray in a perpetual state of bloodlust. Relieved when I managed to put that cursed weapon away, I continued, now heading west, with my trusty and finely ornamented sword by my side. Within seconds, Torrent led me to a cliff from which one could see far and wide. The sky was blood-red, and below me a crumbling church could be spotted. Then I finally saw it, and my heart almost stopped. Limgrave, plentiful land of grassy hills and home of that foul brute by the name of Margit. Feeling the ecstasy of recognition, I finally rode west. As I got to a bridge guarded by a mad fellow wearing a pumpkin helmet, I saw stones often used by the smithing masters. Grabbing them was not without danger. It was here that I suddenly heard a deep voice calling out for help. Looking into the matter, I found a large living jar called Alexander, who, stuck in the ground, sought assistance. After helping him, he mentioned a rot-blighted land called Caelid. He wanted to go there and participate in a combat festival at Redmayne Castle. Why would anyone do such a thing? Leaving the cheerful jar free to resume his travels, I rode on. In want of one final hour of rest before the task at hand, I approached a cabin. Somebody was here, a defiant-looking knight wearing magnificent armor. It was here that I met Bernal, a knight who kindly offered to teach me skills he had acquired throughout a hard life on the road. Only a fool would turn down such an offer, and I was taught how to endure fierce trials and impale enemies with a lethal thrust. Grateful for that fortunate encounter and burning with a lust for revenge, I took one final detour, returning to the nearby church. Blessing my memory, I did find a smithing table here, enabling me to finally strengthen my weapon. Just before leaving, however, I bought a rusty telescope and a torch from Kael. They would surely come in handy. Then I was on my way, and before long, back in the tunnel. I entered the shimmering yellow wall, and there he was, that hideous monstrosity by the name of Margit the Fell. I approached the ghastly thing, but had to realize that hatred itself wasn't enough. He cared not for my disdain, but was too busy molesting me and throwing me off the cliffs. After what seemed like 100 deaths, I remembered the skill taught to me by Bernal. It turned out to be an effective way of dealing with that cane-wielding brute. As I sliced him with a heavy attack, he cried out in pain and began to dissolve in front of me. Yet for some reason, he continued to speak. He was dying, but apparently refused to be quiet. Why would he not hold his tongue? Would he torment me with words henceforth? Leaving that pathetic creature, who was now equipped with nothing but pitiful warnings, I slowly approached the castle. I was finally here. The gate was closed, but as I went through an opening in the wall nearby, a snake-like voice greeted me.
Come over here, would you?
An unsightly fellow insisted that the gate was a terrible idea. Apparently, I could sneak through a hole in the back wall. That weasel was anything but trustworthy, like a lie that had become flesh. Alas, there was no other way. Despite being vigilant, I never saw the hellish claws which came down on me from the sky itself. I did not get to defend myself. Still, it continued relentlessly after dispatching me in the most vile way. Why would it keep pounding? After killing the flying lump of feathered flesh, I came to a cliff with an eerie view, revealing somehow familiar buildings on the horizon. Then I noticed movement. A guard walked the outer castle grounds with a torch, unaware of his impending demise. That little devil blew a horn, calling forth some comrades. Dealing with them in a timely manner, I proceeded through corridors and annihilated every single of the loathsome creatures who stood in my way. I came upon sleeping servants and murdered them as they tried to wake up from their slumber. Jumping across rooftops, I rushed unfortunate soldiers, was attacked with fire from afar, and eventually wound up in front of an intimidating beast, whom I kind-heartedly decided to ignore. Blushing, I sought shelter in a ceremonial chamber, which in turn led me to a curious stairway. Then something unexpected came into view. I found myself in front of a stately, albeit crumbling, bridge, and at the end of this wide open space, a magnificent tower rose. Had I seen this before? Maybe in a dream. Running on this grand bridge from olden days, I felt the weight of time, and was reminded that everything would fall apart. Suddenly I realized that this ancient site wasn't entirely empty. It turned out to be a golem, just like the guardian at Castle Morne. Listening to its heavy footsteps, I saw another one rise nearby, and just as things couldn't get any worse, a third monstrosity appeared far away. What was this place? In terror, I ran without thinking, fleeing those dreadful juggernauts and eventually going right under the nose of that burly archer. At last, safe on the other side of the broken bridge, I found myself in front of the tower. Sadly, it was locked, but as I noticed glowing letters on the ground, a phantom appeared with an otherworldly message. It said that I did not have the right. Returning to the bonfire, I decided not to slaughter the guards in the courtyard just yet, but instead sought the lower levels. Then, as I entered a dark chamber with suspiciously unpleasant odors, I was met with an all-too-familiar fiend. 'Twas one of those fleshy creatures who had greeted me into this eerie world. Destroying that repulsive piece of meat, I finally recognized the filthy chamber for what it truly was, a slaughterhouse decorated with limbs. Maybe this was the obscene womb of those spidery monstrosities. Furious, I came upon measly servants preparing a foul-smelling meal, but dared not take a closer look at their cooking. With everyone gone, I slowly approached a vivid painting of what must have been a great king. Even more impressive was the glorious lion watching over him. The legendary heroes of this world had, this much was certain, been larger than life. Leaving those horrid findings behind, I entered a small space where dogs were eating away at a pile of shrouded bodies. A troll was hanging upside down, and the need to smite those filthy creatures blossomed in me. Killing them without remorse, I found a blood-stained brooch wrapped in fine red velvet. The object was alien to this castle. It had come from far away and for some reason reminded me of gentle Roderica. Coming to terms with the horrors of this infernal place, I could not help but contemplate mortality. Did anyone ever expect such an end, thrown away in a heap of decaying corpses with nothing but emptiness for company? Godrick, that was the villain responsible for this. Boiling with fury, I left the cellar and found myself back at the bonfire. But rest was the last thing on my mind. I was ready to find that decrepit demigod and end his reign of terror. Arriving at the courtyard, discretion seemed like the better part of valor. Benevolent, I spared one of the dreadful sword-wielding hawks, and came within minutes across some adorable jars, not unlike Alexander. Grabbing a cracked pot nearby, it dawned on me. They weren't playful at all. They were out to get me. Fleeing that odd family, I saw, as they retreated, a hitherto hidden entrance. I entered a dark corridor and found sleeping servants. Feeling generous and brimming with superior kindness, I ignored the slumbering creatures and grabbed a mighty shield hidden under the stairs. But Providence, it seemed, found my unselfishness disagreeable. Running back with the glorious treasure, I nearly disturbed a troll guarding the very place I had arrived at. Surely this was it. I found him in a crumbling graveyard, seeming to caress a long-dead dragon. Was this perhaps a private moment? Still, he attacked with fierce suddenness, and sending shockwaves through the ground itself, the beastly ruler said, "Thou art unfit even to graft." What did that mean? Did he consider me beneath him? Did he have the audacity to call me unfit for his obscene harem of mutilated limbs? This time I tore into him with anger, but as I dealt a particularly savage blow, he seemed to evoke secret powers from within the carcass. In the end, though, it didn't matter. I felled that loathsome demigod and delivered him unto eternity. After a troubled sleep, I discovered the unbecoming servant stomping on his former master. Taking a deep breath, I recognized that I was finally free and could leave this castle of terror.